and welcome from London. What is the possibility of Muslims and Christians ending up in a conflict based on a strange twist of geographical fate? For centuries, followers of the two religions coexisted peacefully along the 10th parallel in a line of latitude around 1,100 kilometres north of the equator. But recent research suggests that this has now become an intriguing line of tension. More than 2 billion Christians and Muslims live on the 10th parallel, on one side in the jungles and crowded cities of the Philippines, Malaysia and Indonesia, and on the other side in the deserts and plains of Nigeria, Sudan and Somalia, where the faiths are also colliding. Well, millions died as a result of violence between Christians and Muslims in nations such as Sudan through decades of civil war, which has destroyed the country's institutions and shattered its economy. Under the terms of a 2005 Sudanese peace deal, the mainly Christian South has provisionally voted to secede in a referendum, but many feel the actual split of Sudan could trigger more violence. So today we ask, what are the reasons behind the historical animosity between Muslims and Christians along this geographical marker? Remember, you can send us your comments by email and text message. Well, joining us now from New York is journalist Eliza Griswold, who spent 7 years traveling through these areas of religious conflict and has written about it in her book, The 10th Parallel, Dispatches from the Fault Line Between Christianity and Islam. Eliza, thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you for having me, Riz.
I have to start by asking you, the whole idea that there's a latitude, a fault line between Muslims and Christians that's one particular line across the world where these conflicts arise, seems almost supernatural, almost sort of eerie and bizarre. And I wonder, you've traveled across that 10th parallel since 2003. What was the strongest evidence you found to back that idea?
Well, it's really the history of geography and weather more than anything else. And it's not simply the 10th parallel, it's really a wider swath of land, really that lying primarily between the equator and the 10th parallel. And here is where, if you think of Africa, and I think of Africa kind of shaped like a sock, and you have this massive sock and the northernmost third is dry land. And so this is really where the northernmost third of Africa meets with the sub-Saharan jungle. And the reason that this has become this curious faith-based fault line is simply because the Muslim traders and missionaries who carried the faith south through actually to the 1800s got as far south as the 10th parallel, and here where the jungle began, so did tsetse flies, and the tsetse flies carried sleeping sickness, and it's that sleeping sickness that killed off the horses and the camels that belonged to the traders and missionaries. And so for that very prosaic reason, that's largely where Islam stopped. Now, of course, Christianity, as African Christians would tell you, has been in Africa since 37 AD, since 4 years after Jesus died, but really came back with a special muscularity with European colonial expansion. And some of the missionaries who came along with the Europeans explicitly targeted the 10th parallel to stop Islam from winning the continent. And actually that kind of evangelical language, it's eerie how similar it is to some of what we're hearing today. In Asia, the pattern changes a little bit because here, of course, this is the trade winds. This is where the trade winds carried Christian and Muslim traders and missionaries by ship to the same islands, beaches, and ports. Think of Malacca, the Straits of Malacca, much as they had Hindus and Buddhists before them. So it's really these underlying patterns of geography and weather that have caused centuries of human migration to coalesce at this point.
Let me ask you what made you develop an interest in this particular area? What markers got you interested in looking into this a bit more deeply?
Well, in 2003, I traveled to Sudan with Franklin Graham, who is Billy Graham's son, head of a $500 million American evangelical empire. And he was going to meet with President Bashir, still Sudan's sitting president, who has since been indicted for war crimes by the International Criminal Court. The two men were sitting down to talk about evangelizing, about Graham's right to evangelize among Muslims in the north. And actually, in Sudan, the 10th parallel is the line on which the British marked the division between North and South in 1904. And they did that because of this pre-existing geographic divide. Because, of course, before there were Christians in Africa in the 19th and 20th century, the people who lived along parallel, Balada Sudan, the name itself, land of the blacks, that's an Arabic name, as we know, means this is the beginning of black Africa, where traditionally the Muslim empires to the north raided the south for slaves, gold, and ivory. And so before the people of the south adopted Christianity, they were traditional animist believers. Many still are in Sudan especially. And so the arrival of Christianity, and in particular Christian missionaries, allowed people to form an ideological rival backbone to Islam, a kind of collective identity that became a source of power and rebellion against the traditionally Muslim South. So it's not at all that this fault line is two monolithic religions clashing. It's much more complex than that.
Right. Well, it's interesting you raised the issue of the colonies and so on, because we had an email I'd like to put to you, if I may. Our viewers wrote in some emails, and Billy Hussain in the UK wrote in with an interesting perspective. Billy says, many of the countries along the 10th parallel are colonial states. Conflicts in these regions do not seem to stem from religious differences, but rather from the inability of colonial institutions to govern heterogeneous societies.
Unfortunately, it's just not that simple. It's not either or. The reality of the states along the 10th parallel is that many are weak at best or actually failed. And certainly the role of colonialism is writ large in those failures. What's happened largely is that when the state fails, people turn to other forms of collective identity, religion above all else, even above ethnicity in this region, to determine their rights, their individual rights to the thing that the state should ensure, their rights to education, their rights to clean water, roads, political rights. And so that's how religion comes into it. It's certainly not that the two can be separated. The truth is that these are very complex conflicts with lots of underlying causes, and religion is simply part of the larger whole.
Tell me more about the travels, because you were out there for quite a while, 7 years traveling around. As you say, you started out and you saw this the situation in Sudan. What else did you see on your travels?
Well, I saw many, many things. I would say probably, first of all, I saw the possibility right now in Sudan, as we've been talking about, there is the possibility and likelihood that southern Sudan, for the first time in history, will become its own independent state. So I traveled particularly on the 10th parallel. The sharpest point on the fault line is Abyei, the fraught town now, which really hangs in the balance between North and South Sudan and will largely determine whether or not this transition is peaceful. So certainly listening to the history of those people who live in Abyei, both the Nok Dinka who live to the south and the Arab Missariya who live to the north, listening to them talk about the way in which water, land, their rights to cattle and migration have come into this complicated conflict that for many has taken on the colors of religion. That was fascinating, but I would have to say that the sharpest point that I'd like to bring up is Somalia. We really, especially in the United States, have a responsibility to look at what's happened with our tacit backing since 2006 of Ethiopia's invasion of Somalia, because there's a legacy now. We've essentially created the very enemy we were seeking to destroy. There is now an Islamic rebellion fighting violently among its own people. And so I'd really like us to, it's hard to return to Somalia, right? I mean, and certainly not with boots on the ground, but it's time for our international focus to try to re-engage with that country in the Horn of Africa.
I would get another email to you, if I may. Here, it came in from Elias Nikolakopoulos, who says, religion is the root of the problem. It leads to racism and separates people into good and bad groups. This intolerance is directly related to a lack of education. How do you regard that?
Well, I mean, just like the viewer who wrote in before, some people are going to say that religion is the one root cause. Some people are going to say colonialism is the one root cause. And I would have to say it's just not that simple. Hopefully what the book did, I mean, what I wanted to do in traveling for 7 years from Nigeria, Sudan, Somalia, Ethiopia, Indonesia, Malaysia, and the Philippines, what I wanted to do is break down this overblown and oversimplified clash of civilizations narrative. I wanted to travel to where 4/5 of the world's Muslims actually meet on the ground, because they're not in the Middle East. And we certainly know that, but a lot of people don't. So I wanted to travel to where they actually meet on the ground with nearly half the world's 2 billion Christians. What happens in droughts? What happens in flood zones, political elections, and even, you know, in fights over crops of chocolate in Indonesia? Christians and Muslims have come to blows over the principal ingredient in chocolate, which is cacao. Now, all of those conflicts have complex complex worldly or secular causes. They're all about political economy. Does it mean religion doesn't factor? No, religion does factor. But there is no single cause facing what's going on along the 10th parallel or really anywhere else in the world. And I think our job as journalists is certainly to restore the complexity and try to make those stories compelling enough that they don't have to be reduced to sound bites that simply distort the actual truth of what's going on.
Now, I have to ask you, Eliza, of course, as you mentioned, there's a lack of understanding. You know, as you said, the majority of the Muslims do not live in the Middle East, and you were able to go out and see more. There's also, in this concept of clash of civilizations, there's a lot of negative stereotyping, particularly in America and the West, of Muslims in general. And I wonder, when you went out on your travels, how you were able to make sure you kept an open mind so that when you're writing about this, when you're looking at this, you could take a fair perspective.
Sure. Well, first of all, what I would say that probably the thing people find most surprising in my book is the legacy of Christian militancy, certainly up into this day. Along the 10th parallel, many of these conflicts, I think, particularly in Nigeria, but certainly elsewhere as well, it's simply not true that the Muslims initiate the problems. The Christians do as well. The idea of being a Christian soldier, which again is this legacy of centuries-old evangelical rhetoric, is a literal lived truth. And so I also really think it's very important for us. I mean, the central takeaway of this book is that the most important and most overlooked clashes of our time, the most important religious struggles, are not those between religions. They're those inside of religions. They're those between liberals and conservatives, be they Muslim or Christian, over who has the right to be a true believer, over who has the right to speak for God and why. So really what I saw in traveling is there is no single thing as Islam. There are hundreds of Islams, and the same thing is true for Christianity. And so restoring the complexity and the diversity, I think, is the first step to understanding that we're not dealing with some monolithic clash here.
Now, let me ask you about your travels with Franklin Graham, who, of course, was a guest on this show some time back, and we talked to him about his missions across there. And I wonder, with Franklin, especially as he's a confident and very sort of charismatic, strong-minded person, how his presence sort of fit in and how that affected your travels as well.
Well, Franklin and I share, which we discovered as we traveled. I mean, I certainly knew this about him already, but we're both what are called PKs in the Protestant parlance. We're both preachers' kids, and that tends to lead to particularly a sort of naughty, rebellious streak. And I have to say, with Franklin, with whom I am still in contact, when he comes out with a statement like President Obama is not a true Christian or may not be a true believer, I just call him up, because he loves, and he would tell you himself, he loves the soundbite. He loves saying Islam is a wicked and evil religion. He does believe that. It also it's galvanizing, right? I mean, here is something that whips up fear in followers. And so traveling with Franklin is complicated, because when we met, so we met with Bashir in 2003. This is the first time Franklin had ever met with Bashir, a man now indicted for war crimes, right? The two men sat in the Marble Palace in Khartoum, and the first thing they tried to do is convert one another to their respective faiths. Now, that did not go over terribly well, I have to say. And then what Franklin did, some of us had been ushered out of the room, myself included, and Franklin reached into his pocket and he handed Bashir a George W. Bush 2004 re-election pin. And he said to him, "Mr. President, I understand you'll be speaking to my president later today. Why don't you tell him you're his first voter here in the Sudan?" Now, what is that about? That sort of intersection of faith and foreign policy. For Americans, we don't know very much about what's going on for our emissaries out in the world. And certainly what you were asking before about how is it to restore what is true about Islam? Well, it's certainly important for us to understand why Muslims have such an understanding of us as a Christian West, and that kind of encounter certainly sums that up. So does the fact that until very recently, the only people who doing human rights work or doing relief work in the Muslim world were Christian missionaries. Christian missionaries were the face of the West. I mean, I love the fact, which I learned in the course of researching this book, that, Hassan al-Banna, one of the fathers of the Muslim Brotherhood, his first organization was the YMMA, the Young Men's Muslim Association, which was formed in direct competition to the Young Men's Christian Association, the YMCA. Both of these rival organizations were out there doing health, hygiene, and scripture. It was just different scriptures. So the book attempts to really restore some of the realities to how these two faiths have shaped each other, especially in the current debate.
Right. Eliza, let me quote from your book, The 10th Parallel here, a passage where you talk about not only tensions between Islam and Christianity, but also emerging divisions within the religions. Now you say, and to quote you here, the Christian gospel of prosperity is so powerful that it has spawned a unique Nigerian phenomenon, an Islamic organization called Nasrullahi al-Fatih, or Nasfat. Most conservatives loathe Nasfat and believe that this engagement with the secular world is haram, forbidden and distinctly un-Islamic. Yet faced with the encroachment of Christianity, Nasfat argues that the only way to survive in the religious marketplace is by playing the same game. And it sounds very interesting, this idea of the promise of material well-being as a tool to win converts. And I guess I wonder how common such movements are and how effective they are.
They're extraordinarily common. They're extraordinarily common. And so they come from, I mean, within a Christian context, they come from this idea that a classic quote would be, if God is truly our Father, what kind of father wants his children to be poor? Right? So the idea is that through religion, through Christianity, one can assure one's own wealth. And that's, you know, that you see pastors in flashy cars, and let's be honest, we see them in America more than we see them in Nigeria. They just happen to be in both places. And then there is this very interesting organization, Nasfat, which has its own soft drink, its own travel agency, its own dating group. They were always trying to get, Nasfat was always trying to get me to enlist in this dating service they had. They worship on Sundays, they worship with music, they have huge fairs, and the idea is, listen, we need to engage in contemporary culture. We need to, for example, Nasfat comes out against, they have a whole program about HIV/AIDS. They have a whole program about forming businesses. They are about safeguarding Muslims, helping Muslims find a foothold in the 21st century capitalist world, which again, you know, many conservatives would say is entirely haram, entirely forbidden. Right. They're leaving the scripture in order to do this.
Let me get another email question. This came in from Portugal, and touching on this issue of poverty as well. Virginia Leteri Castelbranco wrote in saying, extreme poverty leading to resentment and desperation is a powerful leverage for extremism. Religious violence is not really different from ordinary violence. And I wonder to what degree poverty is one of the sort of common themes when you look at the tensions along the 10th parallel.
Well, poverty certainly undergirds one of the absolute fundamental principles that makes this line so fraught, which is population growth. Right? Here, populations are growing faster than almost anywhere in the world. On top of that, you have numbers of believers growing fast, right? So poverty it's a difficult determinant. We certainly see Osama bin Laden and his ilk, and that certainly defies the principle that poverty leads to extremism, right? I mean, here's some rich boys who got very pissed off and went and did their own thing. So poverty certainly plays a role in people's devotion to God, but it's hard to even say that, because I would say, when I went in with my Western lens and would say, oh, these believers are going to worship, God is going to pattern their everyday lives because they have nothing, right? Well, it's really not that simple. Certainly, poverty keeps people close to God. And again, as I said, when there's no state entity, when there's no other means to safeguard your rights to even clean water, God certainly comes into play, and so does collective religious identity in a way that isn't true in other situations when the state is there, or you got an SUV to drive to church once a week as opposed to every day.
Let me get another quote from your book, if I may, here, from the 10th parallel.
Sure.
This one is where you talk about Indonesia, it refers to Indonesia. And you say, Indonesia is a country of Islams, not Islam. And its public life is animated by conflicts between Muslims and Muslims, not Muslims and Christians. They involve practical issues that arise out of questions such as, is it legal for Muslims to leave the religion? Can some Muslims be declared heretics? What kind of rights do religious minorities have in a majority Muslim country? And I wonder to what degree you see, you know, the Islamic approach to minorities more evolved in areas such as the Southeast Asian countries than in nations, say, along the 10th parallel in Africa, for example.
Sure, sure. Well, there's one theologian who I think has some very interesting theories. His name is Abdullahi Anaim, and he's at Emory University. He's a professor of religion and the father of a movement he would call liberal Islam today. He's Sudanese. And he would say, look at the way in which Islam takes shape in the world's largest Muslim country, 240 million people, 9 out of 10 of them are Muslim. This is Indonesia, of course. Well, it's really here, again, where populations are growing fastest, where there are these diverse expressions of Islam, which will determine the future of the faith, these borderlands, these lands along the 10th parallel, much more so than any Arabized Islam, any kind of what's going on in Saudi Arabia is less relevant to Islam today than along these porous borders. And I think that's a fascinating theory. Now, Christian theologians who are conservative will make exactly the same argument in reverse, saying, look at how these traditional fundamentalisms are growing up in this same area along the 10th parallel, along these borderlands. This is proof that Christianity is going in a conservative direction. So you have a couple of choices there. And they are unclear whether you're looking at Africa or Asia as to who's got the right theory. And again, it's my job just to bring those theories forward and let people choose.
Now, it's interesting you say that because, of course, as you said at the beginning of the show, it's a very complex picture. It's not as simple as just a clash between Christianity and Islam. Although, of course, in the book, the way the book is titled, it talks about dispatches from the fault line between Christianity and Islam. And I wonder, again, how there is the risk of portraying, well, certainly in this case, say, Muslims in a certain way, in a bad light, perhaps, and the risk of taking this kind of approach where you paint everyone with the same kind of brush and not bring out the complexities.
Well, there certainly would be. If the book did that, that would be a problem. Since it doesn't, I think it's part of the solution. Anybody who doesn't read the book, I don't have much to say about, how can I say, well, it's actually quite complex. You got to read it, right? And again, I would say that I really want it clear that the largest central takeaway of the book is that the most important and overlooked clashes of our time are those inside of religions, not between them. But you would have to read the book to find that out.
Was there anything that really surprised you on these travels? Something that really changed your views in a particular area?
Absolutely. And it really was that it was the story of Ethiopia, right? It was the story that in the early 7th century, when the Prophet Muhammad was facing, potential death at home from his own people, the Quraysh in Mecca, and he had to flee, right? And he headed to Yathrib, excuse me, now Medina, the Prophet's city. He sent, at the same time he fled with most of his followers, just about 200 miles, he sent a dozen of his closest family members and followers to Africa, to the court of a Christian king, because the understanding was that the ties of one shared God were more powerful than those of blood or tribe. And so he sent this dozen followers to the court of a Christian king, and they arrived in what is today Ethiopia, which was then Abyssinia, and they went to the king and they told him a single story. They told him the story of the Virgin Mary giving birth to Jesus, which is of course a story in the Quran as well as in the Bible. And the king, not knowing exactly who they were, gave them some land in a place called Nagash. I was in Nagash about 6 months ago. Descendants of those first followers have been there since. And I think what that story, which I certainly didn't know before I did the reporting for this book and the research entailed in getting the historical lens correct, was how long there's a history of cooperation in Africa, especially, and also how long and largely Africa figures into the history of these two shared religions. It certainly helped remake my mind, which, to be frank, is much more Western-centric, is much more, well, this all happened in Jerusalem. No, it didn't. It happened in Africa.
It's interesting. I wonder, when you on your travels, did you get a sense that, where you have these religions living side by side, they have a better understanding of each other than sometimes people do in the West, where they've been, made into communities that follow these particular lines in a very different way from those who actually have to live together through poverty, through disaster, and so on?
Oh, I wouldn't say sometimes, I would say always. And that really, the idea of doing this book, because again, there is no such thing. I'm a big believer that there's no such thing as objective journalism.
Right. Well, Eliza Griswold, we were out of time. I want to thank you very much for discussing your travels and recounting your book as well.
Thanks a lot, Riz, for having me.
Thank you. Thank you for joining us too. Remember, you can follow the show on Facebook and see what we're up to there. You can give us your feedback on the topics and post your questions and comments. From me and the teams in London and Washington, D.C., we'll see you next time.